Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. So, as Rachel said, I'm going to be chatting to you about entomological legacies. And this was a piece of work that I did for our Power in This Place project. And I was basically kind of trying to explore the ideas of power and legacy from our colonial era and how they could be explored through the entomological collection for a discussion with our community curators. I don't know about you, but our community curators weren't zoologists and they weren't entomologists. And I wanted to make the subject matter as relevant and as engaging as I possibly could. Because whereas I might immerse myself in these things every day, I am sensitive enough to know that bugs aren't everybody's thing, and dead bugs are even less people's thing. So what I'm hoping by the end of today's talk is that perhaps if you have any aversion, you wouldn't be here. But if you have any doubts or aversions about insects, that at the end of it, you might perhaps have a better insight into the amazing stories that my tiny little animals, or our tiny little animals, can tell. Yeah. And basically, I'm going to cover about 5 themes because I thought themes was a good starting point. I'm going to look at scientific and common naming. I'm going to look at traditional ecological knowledge. I'm going to look at species conservation and local guardians. I'll look at the Colonial Office, and then I will finish on a little bit about a collector called Rudolf Pock and his association with scientific racism. The first 3 topics that we look at are all kind of general themes which could be explored through any collections. And the last 2 very much focus on the history of those individual specimens. So closely allied stories. So that's great, Rachel. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. Lovely. So what's in a name was quite a fascinating topic. And I discovered there was an awful lot of research out there that had come to fruition in more recent years. There's about 10 million insects estimated in the world, and about 1 million of those have got names. A lot of those have only got scientific names because they aren't commonly enough encountered to have common names. So when I talk about common names, I mean like human. If I talk about our scientific name, I mean Homo sapiens. So that's the genus Homo and the species sapiens. Yeah. So those are the 2 different types of naming. So we've got all these insects. Some have no names, and there's a lot of naming still to be done. And others have lots and lots of common names because they have big impacts on our lives around the world, and different places around the world have different names for them. One of the things about scientific naming is that the people who give the names, the taxonomists, predominantly have come historically from the global north, whereas the species that they are describing predominantly from the global south. So you can already see where some slight issues might arise. Scientific naming actually has a code which was devised by the British, no surprise there, and it is enforced by an organisation called the International Union of Zoological Nomenclature. And they control the scientific naming of organisms. And when I say control, it's not actually that prescriptive. The main things are, when you name a species, it must be a unique name, and it mustn't be offensive at the time of publication. And whoever publishes the description of a species first, that name takes priority. So if somebody names it afterwards and they didn't know somebody had already published it, it keeps the name of the first publication. The names, when I talk about things being offensive, it depends on the names very much reflect the cultural environment in which they're being allocated, and attitudes change. To illustrate this, you see an example of a small Slovenian cave beetle, which is named after Adolf Hitler, and it still bears that name. Actually, changing scientific names is pretty problematic. And there has been quite some resistance to it in the past, but there's more and more discussions about how that might be broached when you have cases like this. Species might be named after all sorts of things. They might be named after a characteristic of the creature, whether it's big or hairy or spotty or whatever. They might be named after a behavioural feature, something that gives you an insight into the habitat that the insect comes from or the animal comes from, where they come from geographically. But one of the really popular ways to name things is something called eponyms, and eponyms are named after people. And a very large proportion of those are named after rich, white, Western men, because historically that has been who has been honoured through the naming. And there is actually quite a large move to stop eponyms. They don't think that biodiversity naming should be trivialised by being associated with one individual. There's other arguments that have been put forward. Unsurprisingly, actually, this suggestion came from New Zealand, which has one main indigenous language, Maori, and a very limited, their species, there's a lot of endemics, things that are only found in New Zealand. And that's relevant because it means that those things don't have names in other countries, and they don't have names in the same country from a different group of people with different languages or different experiences. So there tends to be more agreement about what those indigenous names might be. And as I mentioned before, not all species even have scientific names, let alone common names. And as I mentioned, some have names in so many languages. And what I do have to say is, for all the problems with scientific names, they are hugely, hugely useful in international science, because not only are they our ticket in Google to find information only about the species that we're interested in, but they are actually understood internationally. And even a paper in Chinese characters, I will be able to pick out the scientific name because it will be written in European lettering, which is not brilliant for everybody, but it's hugely useful for me in knowing if I need to get that paper translated or knowing that it's out there. So there we go, just something on names. Next slide, please, Rachel. So I picked out a few examples of each to kind of fire off some thoughts. I mentioned the New Zealand Indigenous naming, a bit of beautiful naming from the Maoris. You see the large kind of sprawly cricket in the bottom left-hand corner. It's a creature called a weta. And weta literally means the god of ugly things, which I think is rather exquisitely named. Its common name is the Wellington tree weta, named after the Duke of Wellington, who evidently, so this is another issue with naming, of course, places that are named after controversial figures, because the Duke of Wellington was, of course, involved in the colonial suppression of both Ireland and of India. The top left-hand corner, these white and brown moths are gypsy moths, and they are still referred to that in the UK. The America has moved a bit further along in dealing with problems with common names. And the Entomological Society of America has something called the Better Names Project, where they're liaising with communities to try and address common names to make them more less blatantly racist, to tell you the truth, because the gypsy moth is very, very good traveller, which is fine, but it's also a massive pest. So the Romany community are not delighted to have it named after them. And the Americans have now redubbed it the spongy moth, and this refers to its spongy egg masses. So it has a biological reason for that naming, which is always better, I think. So yeah, the spongy moth. And in the top right-hand corner, we've got Grant's or Darwin's stag beetle, which is a rather fabulous-looking species with massive jaws. And it has the honour of being named after two rich white men, and none of them actually found it. So one of them was the courier. Grant was the doctor on board a ship that brought it back to the UK to be described. And Darwin was the one who popularised it. So he found the second specimens, I think, that were brought back to the UK. And it was actually a local native who found it on the island of Chiloe and gave it to Dr. Grant. And in the bottom right-hand corner, I can't even bring myself to say it, but the common name for this species is still used on some of the social media, despite multiple efforts in various different countries where it's found to rename it. Next slide, please, Rachel. So what I always think is one of the problems with dealing with subjects that you're not very familiar with, even if I'm very interested, is you don't always know what questions to ask or what relevance it has to you. So what I tried to do for each theme was to come up with a provocation, which was the things that were going through my head and the questions I was asking, the things that I would perhaps like to uncover or discuss with others about the themes. And for what's in the name, I thought that the interesting things to look at would be the global inequities that are perpetuated by our current naming systems, and when I said and who are community curators and the wider public out there, you guys, think we should name our species. Who should choose that name? Do you think we should name species after people? Do you think we should change the existing names? And then also in my head, I was thinking, well, we're called the Hunterian. We're named after a rich white man from the global north. That's the foundation of our collection, but we're quite a different organisation now. And what does that name say about us? Next slide, please, Rachel. So the next theme that I kind of got into was traditional ecological knowledge. And this is a fascinating area. For the longest time, this kind of local knowledge of the natural environment and the organisms in it and those local resources has largely been ignored and undervalued, or quite often, even worse, appropriated for other people's social or economic benefit, without any recognition to the people who actually had the original ideas and technology. And the further removed we become from nature, the more urbanized we become, the less exposure we have to these creatures, the greater the risk of that knowledge just dying with the old people who currently hold it. So it's a really, really important area, and there's so much in terms of sustainable use of resources, in terms of using resources we don't even, a diversity of organisms in ways that we don't even understand. And that's, the knowledge of how to use those. And there's three different kind of stories I've explored here. In the top left-hand corner, you see a hornet, the big yellow-headed thing, and next to it is a carpenter bee. We're very squeamish about eating insects in the UK, and actually the vast majority is still only, and in the West, and the vast majority are fed to either livestock or to pets. But in other countries, literally hundreds and hundreds of species are eaten. High protein, low fat, really small carbon footprints. So there's a lot of interest in sustainable food in the rearing of these things, particularly with the hornet invasions, knowing how to breed and process and rear big stingy insects like hornets might be hugely valuable, and there's quite a bit of meat on a larvae. In the north of India, in a place called Nagaland, they have a beautifully diverse fauna, and they eat a vast number of different insects, and they have the expertise to actually rear and harvest hornet larvae. So we might be looking to them for advice very soon. And I included the carpenter bee because not only is it eaten in the north of India, but it's also one of the few examples of Western entomophagy. So in Hungary, there's folk records of people eating the honey stomachs of the carpenter bee. Same region of northern India has a wonderful diversity of wild silks. Commercial silk is all from the mulberry silk moth, which is small and white and not nearly as flamboyant and as exciting as these massive Fagara silk moths that you see here on the right-hand side. Wild silk is much harder to rear commercially, but it has properties that are really interesting. It's cooler, it's softer, it doesn't wrinkle as much, it's antibacterial, so it potentially has medical kind of uses. And the knowledge of the rearing and the use of those materials is all within those northeastern Indian communities. At the bottom, the rather strange looking wormy things, you might be able to make out the fat bit is the kind of mummified body of a caterpillar, and the wiggly, big long wiggly tail is a fungus that grows out of it. These are known by different names depending on where you find them. In New Zealand, the Maoris called them a weto, and they burn them and grind them up to make the dye to make their tattoos with. In China, they are hugely coveted. One of the names they're known as is Tibetan gold because they are so valuable now. They grow in the mountains in the Himalayas, and there's quite a shortage of natural resources for mountain communities, so they're a very important source of income. But the unsustainable demand of in fact, a lot of Asian people, because they have a very important traditional Chinese medicine role, has led to great depletions of the stock, and also they're threatened by climate change because the environments, these alpine environments, are one of the first ones to suffer from the heating up. This also couples with the fact that there's an awful lot of terrible Western dismissal of traditional Chinese medicine. And there's more and more acknowledgement now from the West doing its own scientific tests of what brilliant foundations there are for the medicinal qualities in these things. They have a huge array of medicinal uses, which traditional Chinese medicine is known forever. Okay, next slide, please, Rachel. So when I thought about the things that we might explore in relation to this, I thought that hierarchy of knowledge, and we see it in traditional ecological knowledge. We also see it for knowledge in any of the less powerful communities that other people appropriate and use and don't acknowledge. About those condescending values, about the new value now that we're looking for sustainable and diverse methodologies to be able to interact and use the environmental resources in a better way, and about the importance of those quite often very economically challenged rural communities as reservoirs for both natural resources and knowledge, and how the conservation of both those local practices and that traditional eco-knowledge is one way of keeping us connected to nature. Next slide, please, Rachel. This is a beautiful draw of gorgeous monarch butterflies, and this brings us on to our next theme, which is to do with local guardians and species conservation. And I don't know if you know, but the monarchs are legendary for their migration, and over a number of generations, each year they cover a 3,000-mile journey from the forests of Mexico up to the northern United States and Canada, and then they come back again in the fall. Their return in the autumn has huge cultural significance to Mexico, and it actually coincides with the Day of the Dead, and it's meant to be the return of the ancestral souls. So culturally, they have massive significance, and you often see their motifs in Day of the Dead stuff. They have seen terrible declines. The populations have been decimated by our kind of agricultural practices and by our pesticide usage, loss of habitat for cattle ranching, all of that. And they've declined by over 80% since the 1990s, which sadly is not an unusual case for insects. The people and the insects that they respected and the forests all used to be one big happy clump. But in the 1980s, the residents of the forests where the overwintering monarchs return each year were forced out so that it could become a pristine wilderness, human-free. And what was sucked into that vacuum was just an absolute nightmare. It became effectively a no man's land. Illegal logging, drug cartels, violence. So this habitat was no longer even of tourist appeal, and there were even murders of the conservation people who are working with the butterflies. So it all went terribly awry. One of the biggest threats that the monarchs face is managing to make this journey safely. The various successive governments and kind of official conservation organisations have failed to do much about this for years and years. It took the action of a fabulous kind of ground-up group called the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, which was started by a lady from the Creek Nation who liaised with other First People, Indigenous, Native American tribes, all the way up the monarch migration route. And they did growing and planting and education to try and make a better tract for the monarchs to use. And the effects of this were enhanced by work that was going on from community up in Mexico as well. There was a nurseryman who was basically providing stock and technical support and guidance and education to the people in Mexico to help with the reforestation of all of these logged sections of the forest, so that the monarchs would actually have somewhere safe to overwinter. Because whereas North America is getting the full benefits of the pollination services of the monarchs and the majesty and beauty of them visiting their spaces, it's the Mexicans who have borne the brunt of the cost for the conservation. So there's another kind of inequality in how conservation works. And all this bottom-up in inspirational kind of practice that's worked cross borders is sustainable and long-lived and brilliant. It's benefiting both the human and non-human beings. Next slide, please, Rachel. Yeah, so I thought it was a really interesting avenue to explore pristine wilderness. To talk about again, about the inadequacies of current power structures to meet the needs of those rural and traditional communities. Conservation issues of the legacy of greed and unsustainable extraction and exploitation, because that's largely why the monarch's migration route is so perilous. The onus on the global south to pay for it. And the power that communities actually have to support human and non-human beings and to counteract the legacies of greed and unsustainable extraction. And the ideas of sustainability of harvest and reciprocity about us giving something back to nature, and about having a more long-term vision for a world that's become very short-term in its political goals. And the other thing was, it brings us back to naming, which is quite nice. So the monarch butterfly, that's what we call it. That's named after King William III, aka the Prince of Orange, because of its colour, which has no relevance to anything really. And one of the indigenous Mexican names is the harvester, because it comes back when the corn's about to be harvested. Makes far more sense. So thumbs up for the harvester as a name. And there's lovely parallels with the Great Yellow Bumblebee project that's gone on in the Scottish Islands in Tiree. And they've done amazing outreach and planting. Again, didn't get funding, went ahead and did it anyway. And that's had a wonderful legacy for the population of a very rare and special Hebridean bee. Next slide, please, Rachel. So this is the first of the stories that links specifically to specimens in our collection. So disease in both animals and humans evidently had a huge impact on productivity in the colonies. And whilst reducing pests is generally a great thing, and there might have been a number of people with more benevolent intent. The colonial actions with regards to these species were often self-serving and a little bit racist, and quite often they use the control of outbreaks as an excuse to actually implement and further the colonial vision. But these early studies were the foundation of the global health and food security initiatives that we have today. And we still use these collections to train students now from around the globe in these topics. So some quite interesting ones. You will see in the top left-hand corner, the Entomological Research Committee were the first entomological agency formed by the Colonial Office, and they were sent out to tropical Africa to combat the hindrances of human progress in tropical Africa. And by that, we can certainly read of the colonists. And they recruited and trained local boys in military-style operations to target blood-sucking insects, but they collected an awful lot of things. And it's actually harder to find an entomology collection that hasn't got some specimens that were sent back from these early expeditions in the UK than it is to find those with them. And that none of them were retained in Africa. They all came back here for study and for sharing amongst the Western European institutions. In the bottom left, we've got specimens that were collected from Tanzania in the 1930s. They're collected by A.H. Ritchie, and he was working as an agricultural entomologist. What's interesting here is he was working with crops which aren't traditionally found in the area. So coffee is grown in Tanzania, but not the Arabica beans that they were trying to introduce. And tung oil was basically too expensive to be bought by the Chinese, so they were using, and our weather's too lousy for it, so they were hoping that it would succeed in Tanzania, so they introduced these new species. On the right, we have a selection of locusts. These were part of an absolutely decimating locust swarm that hit Zimbabwe and a lot of the rest of Africa during 1932. And that was when Alexander Cuthbertson, a Glasgow-trained agricultural entomologist, was out there doing his bit for the pest effort. 1930s, Zimbabwe was already suffering from the negative effect of drought and depression. And when the pestilence came in, that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. The labour force was being pulled aside to work in the colonial mines, to work in the settler farms, and all the resources from the Department of Entomology in Zimbabwe were being poured into those settler farms. School children were even pulled out of their classes to try and help and deal with the locust invasion, but the native population saw very little benefit from that. Next slide, please, Rachel. So there's a massive number of things that can be explored through the Colonial Office holdings and the insects. These ideas of infrastructure, administration and hierarchy and European networks, colonial agendas that can be disguised as philanthropic, which may have strongly philanthropic elements, but there's a lot of greedy stuff going on. The commodification of local collectors. Some of the discussions in the papers is pretty uncomfortable reading now, talking about the abilities of different tribes in their collecting ability and that kind of thing. But I thought I was quite interested in the fact that the local collectors were actually trained and paid, and I wondered how that changed how we felt about the power dynamics. And also the fact that surely anybody would be grateful for having less blood-sucking insects in their country. So sending those back, perhaps we feel differently about that than extracting beautiful things or diamonds. thinking about the environmental and cultural impact of introducing new crop plants, like we saw in Tanzania with the non-native coffees and the tung oil that doesn't even belong there. They often have quite devastating environmental legacies. And cash crops being grown at the expense of food crops in these countries. You'll see there's outdated colonial country names on our labels, Rhodesia and the like. And it made me curious to how much influence the global north still has on global health and food security, and how much mutually beneficial partnerships have actually replaced that old colonial medicine. And who is benefiting from our entomological research now? And it's nice to explore that through a modern lens and perhaps look at the practices of One Health and the better partnerships that we have with African institutions for research and medical health today. And as I mentioned, we have such a wealth of international food security and medical students that today are trained with those collections. Next slide, please, Rachel. So this brings me on to our last topic. And this was a chance discovery when I was looking for a big blousy butterfly to take out to wow some children with in Govan. And I wanted a nice big birdwing swallowtail. And I pulled open this drawer, and I was initially excited because it said gifted by Elizabeth Alexander. And there's not many ladies' names associated with the entomology collection, so that got me all giddy. And I went to investigate Elizabeth Alexander, hoping that perhaps she was the collector, and there might be an interesting story there. She was the donor, and the story wasn't the one I'd expected to uncover. So the specimens were detailed in the letter from Elizabeth as having come from collector, anthropologist, ethnographer, and medical doctor Rudolf Pock. And they were from, he went on multiple expeditions including those of New Guinea and Kalahari, and those are the ones that we have specimens from in this drawer. He was very revered in his day, but he is now notorious for probably being the archetypal evil collector. And whilst he wasn't predominantly interested in natural history specimens, he brought back a huge number to the institutes in Vienna where he was teaching and operating. One of the reasons that his practices were so frowned upon was he used actual and threatened violence to get the artifacts he wants. And he would have the locals guarded by police whilst they were doing the digging, so armed police at that. And the Pock is even worse because the materials that he brought back, the anthropological and the ethnographical ones, were used to support the racist theories that he was teaching in his racial biology studies. But the weirdest thing is, they were gifted to Elizabeth Alexander, and the Alexander sisters have given quite a few specimens to the Hunterian over the years. They were very learned, and Elizabeth was an artist and oriental scholar. And what her relationship with Pock is a bit bewildering. But when we asked her if there was any more details about the butterflies, she said that she would get in touch with Pock's wife for further details. So we got them after Pock died, and his wife, Hella Pock, worked with him on the collections, both in anthropology and in natural history, and in his racist scientific works. And even worse, she became a racial assessor for the Nazis during the war. So the question that this left me wondering was, what is the connection with Glasgow and scientific racism, and how did Elizabeth Alexander come to have these relationships? And that's something I would very much like to uncover when we have the time, and hopefully it's something we can look into. But I thought it was very interesting to contrast the way that Pock collected with what Papua New Guinea is doing now. And they actually have local butterfly gardens that are produced by the locals on pretty unfertile ground. You don't need a very large patch of land to make a lot of butterflies. Because there's still a demand for these exotic butterflies, they effectively farm them, take a sustainable number and send those out to the collectors so they don't have to collect and decimate those environments. And also for people who prefer their butterflies live, which is the vast majority, they can come and they can benefit from ecotourism, so they can visit these sites. And these sites in Papua New Guinea are far more profitable than, say, logging, which is not sustainable and gives a one-hit small return for the locals. So I was quite interested in the contrast in those practices. Next slide, please, Rachel. Yeah, so I thought there's some very important subjects that can be discussed here. And one is the scientific kind of Linnaean hierarchy of the races, and particularly speciesism, the premise that humans are more important than other life forms and that some humans are far more important than others. And as I said, I would really like to unpick our ties with scientific racism. Yeah, I just like the idea of exploring the idea of butterfly farming and forest guardians versus colonial extraction. And that brings me to the end of the talk.